Hey, Elisa, how you guys doing? Crazy thing happened yesterday. Somebody broke into my house, stole all my light bulbs, stole all the light bulbs. Now, initially, you'd think I'd be pretty upset about this, but instead, I'm delighted, delighted, delighted. Joke of the day. All right. Anyway, today, one topic: the election of 2000. Just talk about an election. So I've got a little bit of video notes and then a YouTube video for you guys to watch as well. And elections are tricky. And what you're going to see here, it's all going to come down to Florida. And there's fallout from this election, which is kind of interesting. Um, and because this election was ultimately determined by the Supreme Court, the government decided that, hey, maybe we should have a better say in elections. And out of this election, you have all this stuff about election security and election fraud and all these types of things, which is something our country is dealing with. And of course, when you talk about election fraud and election security, oftentimes these new security measures basically come down on minority groups, people of color who don't have the IDs or don't have whatever it is being asked of them to prove that they are a voter. So oftentimes these voter security measures are really voter suppression measures, and that's something that our country is still kind of debating with. Interesting kind of note, though, on a local level, a fallout of that is that our last election in Ridgewood was a completely vote by mail election. Um, and so what happened was that, ballots were mailed to us. And the way it works is that, because it's, election day was on the 12th, because it's the mail, you're allowed to, if ballots are, as long as they are postmarked before the 12th, and as long as they arrive by the 14th, they can still be counted. So in Ridgewood, you had about just under 6,000 people vote in an election. It was a very close election. You had 100, and the difference for the school budget, which failed, was 127 votes. The difference for the last village council spot was about 138 votes. That's pretty tight. But what also happened was that 710 votes were disqualified. One of them was mine. And what happened was my ballot was received in time, but it was not postmarked. So even though the county got my ballot in time, it was not postmarked. So why wasn't my mail postmarked? Well, the Ridgewood Post Office does not postmark outgoing mail. They just don't do it. So even though my vote was on time, I was disenfranchised. So yeah, I'm dealing with that right now. So I've written off a strongly worded letter to the governor, a strongly worded letter to the Secretary of State, and I've actually even talked to a couple of lawyers. So we're going to see about this. But anyway, that's kind of the offshoot of where this is kind of came from out of this election. So anywho, talk to you guys later. Stay safe, stay smart, and yeah. Hello, everyone. So today we're going to look at the election of 2000, in which Vice President Al Gore, Democrat of Tennessee, was running against the governor of Texas, George W. Bush, who was the son of George H.W. Bush, who was the president before Bill Clinton. And this election is really, really, really close. So close that on election night, people go to bed not knowing who won the election. And it all comes down to Florida. Um, and again, it's an electoral type of thing. So popular vote wise, more voters around the country voted for Al Gore. But again, it's not the popular vote that determines it, it's Florida. And what made this so confusing and so kind of bizarre is that the networks basically botched this. And so as the voting goes through the course of the night, once the polls close, the networks basically make predictions. And they make those predictions based on exit polling, previous data, that type of thing. And so what you had on election night was this weird kind of back and forth. So initially, they called the state of Florida for Al Gore. And then they took that back and said, all right, maybe we don't know. And then they called it for Bush. And then they took that back and we didn't know. And it came down to the point that whoever won the state of Florida would then become the next president of the United States. And what you had in Florida was an incredibly close election. And I've got a YouTube video actually from the History Channel that will talk about this. Um, but it got so close, down to about 576 votes, if I remember correctly, was the difference between both candidates. And so what you have is a recount. And what you had was, first you have a computerized recount in which you just look at the ballots that way, you print out, and then if it's within 1%, 1/10 of 1%, you then automatically go to a manual recount in which you then look at the ballots. So every county in Florida votes differently. And in Palm Beach County, they used punch cards. And so if you look at your screen, that's the actual ballot. And then what you take is a card and you would slide. So you would take this ballot and it kind of opens like a spiral notebook. So think of it like a spiral. So where all those dots are kind of like what a spiral is. And then what you take is a card and you slide a card underneath the book. And then you take a pen, like a stick, and you poke a hole in who you want to vote for. And that stick then pokes a hole in the card that you put underneath the ballot or underneath the notebook, and then that card can be run by a machine. So we get a couple of problems with this. One, you have to poke completely through that piece of paper on the other side to have your vote registered. So some people don't poke hard enough, or sometimes the paper doesn't give, and you get like this weird kind of like, is it a vote? Is it not a vote? And so for that, you'll see images in the video of them holding up the cards like up to the light to see if they can see any kind of light coming through to indicate that that person did vote or did not vote, that type of thing. Other things you can look at here is that if you're reading the ballot, right? So on the left, you have the Republicans first, the Democrats second, the Libertarians third, right? But it's two-sided, right? There's a left column and a right column. So you're thinking, okay, I don't want the Republicans, I want the Democrats. So the Democrats are second, so maybe I punch the second hole. But as you can see, the second hole lines up with the people on the right side, which is the Reform Party. So there was confusion in which some people punched the second hole because I want the second person on the list, when in reality, if you wanted to vote for the Democrats, you had to punch the third. Right? Now there are arrows there that you see that are supposed to line up with the holes, but depending on how you put the card in the back, they might not necessarily line up correctly. So there were lots of flaws with this ballot that you see here. Needless to say, this became a whole rigmarole in which you had, how are you going to count the ballots? Does the ballot have to be completely punched through? Does there have to be three corners have to be? Can if the little punch out is hanging off the piece of paper but is not completely detached, does it still count? This was a huge kind of dilemma, and so eventually it went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, decided to stop the counting. Basically, they argued that it's an equal protection issue, that the ballots and the counting have to be uniform in every county. And they weren't being uniform in every county. And some places, they don't use that ballot. So it was kind of a mess. And so in a 5-4 decision, with the 5 judges that were appointed by Republicans voting one way, and the 4 judges appointed by Democrats going another way, in a 5-4 decision, they decided to stop the count. And at that point, George W. Bush was ahead by 500 and something votes. So George W. Bush, through intervention of the Supreme Court, wins the election of 2000 and becomes president. And you can imagine the consternation in this country as a result of this. It's very divisive, but all that is put past the country by the time you get to September, because in September, we have the September 11th terrorist attacks, which we can talk about next class.